The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Johnson City, Texas depot, and Grace Oakley pressed one trembling hand against her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick as if sensing her fear. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, only to receive a telegram 3 days ago informing her that her intended husband, Herbert Mitchell, had been killed in a saloon brawl the very week she departed Philadelphia. Now she stood alone in this dusty frontier town with nothing but a worn carpetbag, $17 to her name, and a child growing inside her that belonged to a man who had promised her the world before disappearing into the night. The August heat of 1879 pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight as she stepped onto the wooden platform, her dark green traveling dress already covered in a fine layer of Texas dust. Grace was 22 years old, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The other passengers hurried past her, eager to escape the oppressive afternoon sun, leaving her standing there with nowhere to go and no one expecting her arrival. "Miss, you cannot stay on the platform." The station master, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked at her with a mixture of pity and impatience. "Do you have someone meeting you?" Grace opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say? That she had come all this way to marry a dead man? That she was carrying another man's child and had hoped marriage would provide respectability and safety? The shame burned through her chest, making it hard to breathe. "I was supposed to meet my intended husband," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I received word that he has passed." The station master's expression softened slightly. "I am sorry for your loss, miss. Johnson City has a boarding house down on Main Street. Mrs. Henderson might have a room available, though I cannot speak to the cost." Grace nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. She would not cry here, not in front of strangers. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences with whatever dignity she could muster. She picked up her carpetbag and started walking in the direction the station master had pointed, her shoes clicking against the weathered wooden boards. Johnson City was smaller than she had imagined, with a single main street lined with businesses that looked as though they had been constructed hastily and without much care for aesthetics. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, and Grace felt perspiration trickling down her back beneath her corset. She passed a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a saloon from which the sounds of raucous laughter spilled out into the street. Several men lounged against the saloon's porch railing, and their eyes followed her progress with undisguised interest. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, clutching her bag more tightly. The boarding house, when she finally reached it, was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. Grace climbed the steps carefully, mindful of her balance, and knocked on the door. After what felt like an eternity, a heavy-set woman with graying hair answered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you?" Her tone was not unkind, but there was a weariness to it that suggested she had dealt with too many travelers and too many hard-luck stories. "I am looking for a room," Grace said. "The station master suggested I speak with Mrs. Henderson." "That would be me." The woman looked Grace up and down, her gaze lingering on the slight swell of her belly that the traveling dress could not quite conceal. "How long are you planning to stay?" "I am not certain," Grace admitted. "Perhaps a week while I sort out my circumstances." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew skeptical. "I require payment in advance. $2 for the week, meals included. If you stay longer, we can discuss arrangements." Grace felt relief wash over her. $2 she could manage, at least for now. After that, she would need to find work, though she knew that opportunities for respectable employment were limited for a woman in her condition. She reached into her small purse and counted out the coins, placing them in Mrs. Henderson's outstretched palm. "Room 3, upstairs to the right," Mrs. Henderson said, pocketing the money. "Dinner is at 6. We keep a quiet house, no gentlemen callers, no drinking." "Of course," Grace said quickly. "Thank you." The room was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. But it was clean, and the window overlooked the street, letting in the late afternoon light. Grace set down her carpetbag and sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion and despair. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palms. "I am sorry," she whispered to the child. "I am so sorry for bringing you into this world with so little to offer." Her thoughts drifted back to Philadelphia, to the life she had left behind. She had worked as a seamstress in her aunt's dress shop, living in a cramped room above the store and sending most of her meager wages home to her widowed mother in Boston. Then Thomas Whitfield had walked into the shop one spring afternoon, charming and well-dressed, claiming to be a merchant's son. He had courted her with pretty words and promises of marriage, and Grace, lonely and yearning for something more than the drudgery of her daily existence, had believed him. She had given him everything, convinced that they would be married within the month. Instead, when she told him about the baby, he had disappeared without a trace. Her aunt had discovered the truth shortly after, and Grace had been dismissed from her position, her reputation in ruins. She could not return to her mother in Boston, could not bear to bring such shame upon her family. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like divine intervention, a chance to start over in a place where no one knew her past. But now Herbert Mitchell was dead, and Grace was more alone than ever. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking on her door, calling her to dinner. Grace rose slowly, splashing water on her face from the basin and smoothing her hair as best she could. She made her way downstairs to a small dining room where several other boarders had already gathered around a long wooden table. Mrs. Henderson served beef stew and cornbread, simple fare but plentiful and well prepared. Grace ate quietly, avoiding the curious glances of the other guests. There was a traveling salesman who spoke too loudly about his recent successes, an elderly woman who said nothing at all, and a young couple who held hands beneath the table when they thought no one was looking. Grace felt a pang of envy watching them, wondering if she would ever know that kind of uncomplicated affection. The following morning, Grace woke early and ventured out to explore the town more thoroughly. She needed to understand what opportunities might exist for her, what options she had beyond the limited funds in her purse. She walked past the general store, noting a handwritten sign in the window advertising for a clerk. But she knew they would never hire a woman in her condition. The dress shop was even smaller than her aunt's establishment had been, and when she inquired within, the proprietor, a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Cartwright, took one look at her and said they had no positions available. By midday, Grace felt her hope dwindling. She sat on a bench outside the general store, fanning herself with her hand and trying to gather the courage to continue her search. That was when she first saw him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days working outdoors. He wore typical rancher's attire, a worn cotton shirt, denim trousers, and scuffed leather boots, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention when he tipped his hat in her direction. Eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and penetrating and unexpectedly kind. "Morning, madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his chest. "You look like you could use some water. This heat is not fit for sitting outdoors." Grace felt her cheeks flush, though whether from the heat or his attention she could not say. "I am quite all right, thank you." He studied her for a moment longer, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her, past the careful composure she tried to maintain, straight to the desperation beneath. Then he nodded and continued into the general store, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She learned his name that evening from Mrs. Henderson, who proved to be a font of information about everyone in Johnson City. Kyle Yancy owned a modest cattle ranch about 5 miles outside of town, Mrs. Henderson explained while serving supper. He had come to Texas from Missouri 7 years earlier, after the war, and had built his spread from nothing through hard work and determination. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts, a decent man who paid his debts and treated his ranch hands fairly. "Half the unmarried women in this county have set their caps for him," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing smile. "But he has never shown interest in settling down, comes to town once a week for supplies and keeps to himself otherwise." Grace absorbed this information silently, wondering why the widow was telling her all this. She had no designs on Kyle Yancy or any other man. She needed employment, not another romantic entanglement that would only lead to heartbreak. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 3 days later, Grace was walking back to the boarding house after another fruitless morning of job hunting when she felt a sudden sharp pain in her lower back. She gasped, pressing one hand against the wall of the nearest building for support, waiting for the pain to pass. It had happened a few times over the past week, brief episodes that left her breathless but always faded after a few minutes. The baby kicked vigorously, as if protesting the discomfort. "Madam, are you all right?" Grace looked up to find Kyle Yancy standing beside her, concern etched across his sun-weathered features. Up close, she could see that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow, and that his gray eyes held an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her discomfort. "I am fine," she managed, though the pain was building rather than subsiding. "Just a moment of weakness in this heat." He did not look convinced. "When did you last eat?" Grace tried to remember. She had skipped breakfast to save money, planning to make do with whatever Mrs. Henderson served for dinner. "This morning," she lied. Kyle's expression grew stern. "You are a terrible liar, madam. Come with me. The cafe is just across the street and you need proper food." "I cannot accept," Grace protested, though the pain was making it difficult to think clearly. "It would not be proper." "What is not proper is letting a woman in your condition faint in the middle of the street," Kyle said firmly. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Grace took it, grateful for the support as they crossed to the small cafe she had noticed but never entered, assuming it was too expensive for her dwindling resources. Kyle guided her to a corner table and signaled the waitress, a cheerful young woman who clearly knew him. "Bring us 2 plates of whatever you have hot, and water." "Right away, Kyle," the waitress said, her eyes dancing with curiosity as she glanced between him and Grace. "I really cannot let you do this," Grace said once they were alone. "You have been very kind, but I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "What is your name?" Kyle asked instead of responding to her protest. Grace Oakley." "Well, Miss Oakley, I suspect you are indeed capable of taking care of yourself under normal circumstances, but these do not appear to be normal circumstances." His gaze flickered briefly to her belly, then back to her face. "How long have you been in Johnson City?" Grace felt the familiar shame rising in her throat. 4 days. I came to marry Herbert Mitchell, but he died before I arrived." She waited for Kyle's expression to change, for the judgment and condemnation she had seen in so many other faces. Instead, he simply nodded slowly. Herb was a good man, but he had a fondness for whiskey that got him into trouble more than once. I am sorry for your loss. The waitress returned with 2 plates of roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans, along with glasses of cool water. Grace's stomach growled audibly, betraying her hunger. She picked up her fork, trying to eat slowly and maintain some semblance of dignity, but the food tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. Kyle ate his own meal without speaking, giving her space to collect herself. Finally, when she had finished most of what was on her plate, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her thoughtfully. Miss Oakley, I am going to be direct because I believe you do not have time for dancing around the truth. You need work, and you need it soon, or you would not have been walking around town in this heat looking like you might collapse at any moment. Am I correct? Grace set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. Yes. I have a proposition for you, and I want you to hear me out before you refuse. Kyle's voice was steady, measured. I need someone to manage my household. My last housekeeper left 3 months ago to live with her daughter in San Antonio, and I have been making do on my own, but the ranch house is falling into disarray. I can offer you room and board, a fair wage, and a safe place to have your child when the time comes. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. You would hire me, even knowing my circumstances. Your circumstances are your own business, Kyle said. What matters to me is that you need help and I need help. It seems like a practical arrangement. But what will people say? Grace could already imagine the gossip that would spread through Johnson City like wildfire. Kyle's expression hardened slightly. People will always find something to say, Miss Oakley. In my experience, the opinion of those who have nothing better to do than judge others is not worth much consideration. The question is whether you are willing to accept my offer. Grace felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. It was more than she had dared hope for, a solution that would give her child a fighting chance. But there was something about Kyle Yancy's steady gaze that made her want to be honest, even if it cost her this opportunity. The child is not Herbert Mitchell's, she said quietly. I never met Herbert. I was desperate when I answered his advertisement, fleeing from my own mistakes. I do not want you to take me in under false pretenses. Kyle was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. I figured as much, he said gently. A woman does not travel halfway across the country to marry a man she has never met unless she is running from something. I am not interested in your past, Miss Oakley. I am offering you a fresh start, nothing more and nothing less. What you choose to do with it is up to you. Grace felt something crack open inside her chest, some hard shell she had built around her heart to protect herself from further hurt. This man, this stranger, was offering her kindness without judgment, help without conditions. It was more than she deserved, more than she had ever expected to find. I accept, she whispered, and thank you more than I can ever express. Kyle squeezed her hand once before releasing it. You can thank me by being ready to leave tomorrow morning. I have business to finish in town today, but I will collect you from Mrs. Henderson's at 8 o'clock. Bring whatever belongings you have. The ranch house has been a bachelor's quarters for too long, and it could use a woman's touch. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn, too nervous and excited to sleep. She packed her few belongings carefully, folding her 2 extra dresses and her nightgown, placing her mother's Bible and the small daguerreotype of her parents in the top of the bag where they would be safe. She counted her remaining money, $15 now, and tucked it into the hidden pocket she had sewn into her petticoat. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and waited for 8 o'clock to arrive. Kyle was exactly on time, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. He helped Grace up onto the seat beside him with a gentleness that surprised her, making sure she was settled comfortably before climbing up himself. Mrs. Henderson watched from the porch, her expression unreadable. "You take care of yourself, Miss Oakley," the widow called. "And remember, you always have a place here if you need it." Grace waved, touched by the unexpected kindness. Then Kyle clicked to the horses and they were moving, leaving Johnson City behind and heading out into the open countryside. The landscape was different from anything Grace had known in Philadelphia or Boston. The land rolled away in every direction, covered in hardy grasses and scattered with scrub oak and mesquite trees. The sky seemed impossibly vast, stretching overhead in a brilliant blue expanse unmarred by buildings or smoke. Despite the heat, Grace found herself captivated by the raw beauty of it. "It takes some getting used to," Kyle said, noticing her expression. "The emptiness. But after a while, you start to appreciate the space, the quiet. Makes you feel like you can breathe." "It is beautiful," Grace said softly. "I never imagined anything like this." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. Grace found herself stealing glances at Kyle, studying his profile. He had a strong jaw, a straight nose, and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned, though his expression at the moment was serious and focused on the road ahead. "Tell me about the ranch," Grace said finally, curious about her new home. Kyle's features softened. "It is not large as ranches go. About 500 acres of grazing land, a main house, a barn, and a bunkhouse for the hands. I run about 200 head of cattle, mostly longhorns, though I have been experimenting with breeding them with some eastern stock to improve the meat quality. I have 3 permanent hands and hire on extra men during roundup and when we drive cattle to market." "It sounds like a lot of work," Grace observed. "It is," Kyle agreed, "but it is mine. I built it from nothing, and every fence post, every head of cattle, represents something I earned through my own sweat and determination. There is satisfaction in that, in knowing that what you have is the result of your own labor." Grace heard the pride in his voice and understood it. She had felt something similar when she completed a particularly difficult dress, the sense of accomplishment that came from creating something beautiful with her own hands. "I hope I can be useful to you." "I am sure you will be," Kyle said. "The house is in desperate need of organization. I am afraid my housekeeping skills are rudimentary at best. I can cook beans and bacon without burning them, but beyond that, my abilities are limited." Grace smiled despite herself. "I am a fair cook, and I have experience with household management. My aunt owned a dress shop in Philadelphia, but I often helped manage the living quarters above the store." "Then you are already more qualified than I am," Kyle said with a hint of humor in his voice. The ranch came into view just before 9:30, nestled in a small valley with a creek running along the eastern edge of the property. The house was a single-story structure built from rough-hewn logs and planks, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney rising from one end. It was not fancy, but it looked solid and well-maintained, the kind of place that would weather storms and stand for generations. Kyle pulled the wagon up in front of the house and helped Grace down carefully. She stood for a moment, taking in her new surroundings. The barn was a short distance away, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. The air smelled of grass and livestock, and something indefinably clean that she realized was simply the absence of city smoke and grime. "Welcome to the Yancy Ranch," Kyle said, picking up her carpetbag. "Let me show you inside." The interior of the house was dim and cool after the bright sunshine. Grace's eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. There was a stone fireplace, a long wooden table with 6 chairs, shelves lined with dishes and supplies, and a cast iron stove that looked relatively new. 2 doors led off from the main room, presumably to bedrooms. "The room on the right is yours," Kyle said, setting her bag down near the door. "It has a decent bed and a wardrobe. The room on the left is mine. There is also a wash house out back with a pump and a tub for bathing." Grace walked to the doorway of what would be her room and peered inside. It was larger than her room at the boarding house, with a real bed frame and mattress, a wardrobe as Kyle had promised, and even a small dresser with a mirror above it. A window looked out over the creek, and lace curtains, yellowed with age, hung limply on either side. "It is perfect," she said, meaning it. "Thank you, Mr. Yancy." "Just Kyle, please," he said. "We are going to be living under the same roof. No need for formality." "Then you must call me Grace." He nodded, and something passed between them, a quiet understanding that this arrangement was the beginning of something neither of them could quite name yet. Over the following days, Grace settled into a routine at the ranch. She woke early, before the sun rose, and prepared breakfast for Kyle and the 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. There was Miguel, a weathered Mexican cowboy in his 50s who had worked for Kyle since the beginning. Sam, a young man of about 20 with a quick smile and an even quicker temper. And Hank, a quiet former soldier who rarely spoke but worked harder than any 2 men combined. After breakfast, Grace would tackle the house, which was indeed in desperate need of attention. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, organized the pantry, and mended the worn curtains. She cooked hearty meals for the men, learning to work with the ingredients available on the ranch, and occasionally sending Sam into town for supplies she could not do without. Kyle was kind but distant, treating her with careful respect that never crossed into familiarity. He worked long hours, leaving before dawn and often not returning until after sunset. When he was in the house, he was polite and appreciative of her efforts, but he never lingered to talk, never asked personal questions or shared much about himself beyond the basics of ranch operations. Grace told herself this was exactly as it should be. She was an employee, nothing more, and it would be foolish to imagine otherwise. But she found herself watching for Kyle's return each evening, found her heart lifting when she heard his boots on the porch steps. He had a way of moving that was both confident and graceful, and when he smiled, which was rare but genuine, it transformed his entire face. 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace was working in the kitchen garden that Kyle had started but neglected, pulling weeds and trying to coax the struggling vegetable plants back to health. The baby had been particularly active that morning, and she paused frequently to rest her hand on her belly and catch her breath. She was lost in thought when she heard voices coming from the direction of the barn, raised in anger. Concerned, Grace set down her trowel and walked toward the commotion. She found Kyle and Sam facing each other in the yard, both men tense and clearly furious. "You had no right to sell those 3 steers without my authorization," Kyle was saying, his voice hard as iron. "This is my ranch and every business decision goes through me. Is that clear?" Sam's face was flushed red. "I was trying to help. That buyer offered top dollar, and I thought you would be pleased to have the extra cash." "I do not care what you thought," Kyle said. "Those steers were not for sale. I was holding them to breed with the new heifers I am bringing in next month. You have just cost me significant money and time because you could not follow simple instructions." Sam looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Kyle's expression must have warned him that would be a mistake. He spun on his heel and stalked off toward the bunkhouse, his shoulders rigid with barely suppressed anger. Kyle stood for a moment, running a hand through his dark hair in frustration. Then he noticed Grace standing nearby and his expression shifted, embarrassment replacing anger. "I apologize," he said. "You should not have had to witness that." "You have nothing to apologize for," Grace said quietly. Sam was in the wrong. He overstepped his authority. Kyle walked toward her, and she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Sam is young and impulsive. He means well, but sometimes his eagerness causes more problems than it solves. "I should have been clearer about my plans. You cannot anticipate every mistake someone might make," Grace pointed out. "That is not a failing on your part." Kyle stopped in front of her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Grace felt her breath catch at the intensity in his gray eyes, at the way he was studying her as though seeing her for the first time. "You are generous to say so," he said finally. "Most women would have retreated into the house rather than involve themselves in ranch business." "I am not most women," Grace said, lifting her chin slightly. "No," Kyle agreed, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, you are not." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Grace was afraid to name. Then the baby kicked hard enough that Grace gasped and pressed both hands to her belly. Kyle's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Are you all right? Is it the baby?" "The baby is fine," Grace said, laughing a little. "Just very active today. Sometimes I think this child is already protesting the unfairness of the world." Kyle's gaze dropped to where her hands rested on her swollen belly, and something flickered across his face that Grace could not quite read. Longing, perhaps, or sorrow, or some complex mixture of emotions she could not untangle. "When is the baby due?" he asked quietly. "Early November, I think," Grace said. "It is difficult to be certain, but the midwife I saw in Philadelphia estimated early to mid-November." Kyle nodded slowly. "We will need to make arrangements. There is a doctor in Johnson City, though I am not sure how much experience he has with birthing. There might be a midwife in one of the neighboring ranches." The casual way he included himself in those plans, the assumption that he would be involved in preparing for her child's arrival, made Grace's throat tighten with emotion. "You have already done so much for us. I cannot ask you to do more." "You did not ask," Kyle said simply. "I am offering. That child deserves to come into this world with people who will care for it, who will make sure it is safe and healthy. You both do." Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough over the past months. She did not want Kyle to see her as weak or pathetic. "Thank you," she managed. "I do not know what I did to deserve your kindness, but I am grateful for it every day." Kyle reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against her cheek, and Grace felt heat flood through her at the simple touch. "You do not need to deserve kindness, Grace," he said softly. "It should be freely given without conditions or expectations." Then he stepped back, breaking the spell, and cleared his throat. "I should get back to work. Those fence posts are not going to repair themselves." Grace watched him walk away, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath her palm, and tried to calm the confusion of emotions swirling through her. She could not afford to develop feelings for Kyle Yancy. He was her employer, her benefactor, the man who had given her a chance when she had nowhere else to turn. To imagine that his kindness meant anything beyond simple decency would be foolish and dangerous. But as the weeks passed and summer faded into autumn, Grace found it increasingly difficult to maintain that emotional distance. Kyle was not distant by nature, she realized. He was simply cautious, carefully protective of his heart in the same way she was protective of hers. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls between them began to lower. It started with small things. Kyle began lingering after dinner, helping Grace clear the dishes and wash them while they talked about their days. He told her stories about his life before Texas, about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to typhoid when he was 18, and deciding to head west to build a new life. He spoke about the war, though only in general terms, making it clear that some memories were too painful to revisit in detail. Grace, in turn, found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Kyle about her childhood in Boston, about her father's death when she was 12, and the financial struggles that followed. She spoke about her mother, a strong woman who had done her best to provide for Grace and her two younger sisters, working as a laundress until her health failed. She even told him about Thomas Whitfield, about the promises and lies, about the crushing realization that she had been nothing more than a conquest to him. Kyle listened without judgment, his gray eyes steady and compassionate. When she finished, he simply said, "He was a fool to let you go. Any man would be lucky to have you in his life." The words warmed Grace more than they should have, settling into her heart like embers that refused to be extinguished. In mid-October, when the first cool breezes began to blow in from the north, bringing relief from the oppressive heat, Grace woke one morning to find the house unusually quiet. She dressed quickly, her movements increasingly awkward as her belly grew larger, and made her way to the kitchen to start breakfast. But when she opened the door, she found Kyle already there, standing in front of the stove with a frying pan in hand, and a look of intense concentration on his face. "What are you doing?" Grace asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Kyle looked up, and she saw a flash of embarrassment cross his features. "I thought you could use a morning to rest. You have been working too hard, and I know the baby has been keeping you awake at night." Grace felt her heart squeeze. It was true that she had been sleeping poorly, the baby's movements and the increasing discomfort of her condition making it difficult to find a comfortable position. But she had tried to hide her exhaustion, not wanting Kyle to think she could not handle her responsibilities. "You did not need to do this," she said softly, walking toward the stove. She looked into the pan and saw what appeared to be scrambled eggs, though they were slightly burned around the edges. "But I appreciate the effort." "They are not very good," Kyle admitted, poking at the eggs with a fork. "I told you my cooking skills were limited." "Let me help," Grace said, reaching for the fork. Their fingers brushed, and she felt that now familiar jolt of electricity that seemed to pass between them whenever they touched. They cooked breakfast together, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that came from weeks of shared space and growing comfort. When the meal was ready, they sat down at the table alone. The ranch hands had already eaten and gone out to work, leaving Kyle and Grace in peaceful solitude. "I have been thinking," Kyle said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "about what will happen when the baby comes." Grace set down her fork, her stomach suddenly tight with apprehension. "What do you mean?" Kyle met her eyes directly. "You will need help after the birth. Someone to look after you and the baby while you recover. I have been asking around, and there is a woman named Mrs. Sullivan who lives about 10 miles north of here. She used to be a nurse before she married, and she has delivered more babies than I can count. I thought I might ride out and ask if she would be willing to stay here for a few weeks when your time comes." Relief washed through Grace, followed quickly by gratitude so intense it made her chest ache. "You would do that? Arrange for someone to help me?" "Of course," Kyle said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I want you to be safe, Grace. You and the baby both." Grace felt tears welling up, and this time she did not try to stop them. They spilled down her cheeks in hot trails, and she covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the depth of Kyle's care. "I am sorry," she said, her voice muffled by her palms. "I do not know why I am crying. You have been nothing but kind, and here I am, acting like a foolish child." She heard the scrape of Kyle's chair, and then he was kneeling beside her, gently pulling her hands away from her face. He produced a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at her tears with surprising tenderness. "You are not foolish," he said firmly. "You are carrying a child, alone and far from everyone you have ever known. You have every right to feel overwhelmed sometimes." Grace looked down at him through her tears and saw such genuine concern in his eyes that it nearly undid her completely. "Why are you being so good to me?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Kyle was silent for a long moment, his thumb still brushing away the tears from her cheek. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Because you matter, Grace. You matter to me more than I probably should admit." Grace's breath caught. "Kyle." He stood abruptly, as though realizing he had said too much. "I should get to work. The cattle are not going to tend themselves." He was halfway to the door before Grace found her voice. "Kyle, wait." He stopped, his hand on the doorframe, but did not turn around. "You matter to me too," Grace said quietly. "More than is wise, considering my circumstances." She saw his shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. Then he looked back at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her pulse race. "We will talk about this," he said. "Soon. But right now, I need to think and you need to rest. Promise me you will take it easy today." "I promise," Grace said, though she knew rest would be impossible with her mind and heart in such turmoil. After Kyle left, Grace tried to go about her usual routine, but she found herself distracted, replaying their conversation over and over. What did Kyle mean when he said she mattered to him? Was it simply the affection of a friend, or something deeper? And what did it mean that she had admitted her own feelings, however obliquely? The questions swirled through her mind as she worked, making it difficult to focus. She was folding laundry in the main room when she heard the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Concerned, she went to the window and saw Kyle and Miguel riding hard toward the house, with something draped across Kyle's saddle. Grace hurried to the porch, her heart hammering with worry. As they drew closer, she realized it was a person, a man, slumped unconscious across Kyle's horse. Blood stained his shirt, dark and spreading. "Grace, I need you to clear the table and boil water," Kyle called as he dismounted. "Miguel, help me get him inside." Grace moved quickly, pushing aside her own fear to focus on what needed to be done. She swept everything off the table and covered it with a clean sheet, while Kyle and Miguel carried the injured man inside. As they laid him down, Grace got her first good look at his face. He was young, probably no more than 25, with fair hair and a thin, angular face twisted in pain even in unconsciousness. "What happened?" Grace asked, filling a large pot with water and setting it on the stove. "We found him about 2 miles from here," Kyle said, his hands already working to cut away the man's bloodied shirt. "Looks like he was shot, probably by rustlers. He has been bleeding for a while." Grace brought over towels and began helping Kyle clean the wound. It was in the man's shoulder, a through-and-through shot that had missed the major arteries but was still serious. She had never dealt with a gunshot wound before, but she forced herself to remain calm, to focus on the task at hand. "Miguel, ride to Johnson City and bring back the doctor," Kyle ordered. "Tell him we have a gunshot victim and to come as fast as he can." Miguel nodded and left immediately, leaving Kyle and Grace alone with the injured man. They worked together in tense silence, cleaning the wound and packing it with clean cloth to slow the bleeding. The man groaned and stirred occasionally, but did not regain consciousness. "Will he live?" Grace asked quietly. "I do not know," Kyle admitted. "He has lost a lot of blood. But if we can get the bleeding stopped and keep infection from setting in, he has a chance." They stayed with the man through the afternoon, changing his bandages and trying to get water into him when he was lucid enough to swallow. Kyle told her the man had said his name was William Carter before he passed out again, and that he had been working as a ranch hand at the Peterson spread about 15 miles east. The doctor arrived just before sunset, a brusque older man named Dr. Halstead, who examined the wound with practiced efficiency. He cleaned and stitched it properly, leaving instructions for care and a bottle of laudanum for the pain. "He is young and strong," Dr. Halstead said as he packed his bag. "If fever does not set in, he should recover. But he will need rest and careful tending for at least 2 weeks." After the doctor left, Kyle set up a makeshift bed in the corner of the main room where they could keep an eye on William. Grace insisted on taking the first watch, settling into a chair beside the injured man with her knitting to keep her hands busy. Kyle brought her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "You do not have to do this. I can watch him tonight." "You have been working since dawn," Grace pointed out. "Besides, I am not going to be able to sleep anyway. I might as well be useful." Kyle studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Wake me if you need anything or if his condition changes." "I will," Grace promised. She watched Kyle disappear into his room, then turned her attention back to William. The young man was sleeping fitfully, his face pale and drawn with pain despite the laudanum. Grace found herself praying, something she had not done much of lately, asking whatever power might be listening to spare this young man's life. William Carter survived the night and the next day, and slowly, over the following week, began to recover. He was weak and in considerable pain, but the fever that Kyle and Grace had feared never materialized. As he grew stronger, he told them more about what had happened. He had been driving cattle with 2 other hands when they were ambushed by rustlers. His companions had been killed and William had barely escaped with his life. "I owe you both everything," William said one evening as Grace brought him dinner. "If you had not found me, I would have died out there." "We did what anyone would do," Grace said gently. "You just focus on getting well." As October drew to a close and November approached, Grace felt her own body preparing for the baby's arrival. She was huge now, her belly so large that simple tasks like bending over or standing for long periods became difficult. Kyle watched her with increasing concern, constantly urging her to rest, to let him handle more of the household tasks. "I am pregnant, not invalid," Grace protested one morning when Kyle tried to take over her morning chores entirely. "I need to stay active. It is better for the baby." "I just do not want you to overdo it," Kyle said, his worry evident. "You mean too much to me to risk anything happening to you." Grace felt her heart skip at his words. Since their conversation weeks earlier, neither of them had returned to the subject of their feelings. But the air between them had changed, charged with an awareness that was impossible to ignore. They moved around each other carefully, like 2 people circling something they both wanted but were afraid to reach for. On the first day of November, Grace woke to a dull ache in her lower back that she recognized immediately. The baby was coming. She lay in bed for a few minutes, timing the pains, and realized they were coming regularly, about 15 minutes apart. She had time, but not much. She rose carefully and dressed, then made her way to Kyle's room. She knocked softly on the door and he answered immediately as though he had not been sleeping. "Grace, what is wrong?" "The baby is coming," she said, surprised at how calm her voice sounded. "The pain started about an hour ago." Kyle's face went pale in the lamplight. "An hour? Why did you not wake me sooner?" "Because there was nothing to do yet," Grace said reasonably. "But I think you should ride for Mrs. Sullivan now, and perhaps send Miguel for Dr. Halstead as well." Kyle was already pulling on his boots and shirt. "I am going right now. Will you be all right alone?" "William is still here," Grace pointed out. The young man had largely recovered and was planning to leave in a few days, but he was currently sleeping in the bunkhouse. "And women have been having babies without help since the beginning of time." "I will be fine." Kyle cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes intense and worried. "You be strong, you hear me? You and that baby are going to be just fine." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. Then Kyle was gone, thundering off into the pre-dawn darkness on his fastest horse. The contractions grew stronger and closer together as the morning progressed. William, once he understood what was happening, did his best to help, bringing Grace water and towels and trying not to look too terrified by the entire situation. Grace appreciated his efforts, but she found herself desperately wishing for female company, for someone who had been through this before and could tell her that what she was feeling was normal. Mrs. Sullivan arrived just after noon, a stout woman with gray-streaked hair and capable hands. She took one look at Grace and immediately took charge, shooing William out of the room and helping Grace into her nightgown. "How far apart are the pains?" Mrs. Sullivan asked briskly. "About 5 minutes," Grace gasped as another contraction gripped her. "Good, good. First babies usually take their time, but you are progressing nicely." Mrs. Sullivan examined her and nodded with satisfaction. "A few more hours, I would guess. You are doing well, dear." Kyle arrived back at the ranch around 2 in the afternoon, having ridden all the way to Johnson City and back. Dr. Halstead was with him, looking slightly disgruntled at having been dragged out for what he clearly considered women's work. But he examined Grace professionally enough and confirmed Mrs. Sullivan's assessment. "Everything looks normal," he said. "Mrs. Sullivan will handle the delivery. I will stay in case of complications." As the afternoon wore into evening, Grace found herself losing track of time. The contractions consumed her world, waves of pain that left her breathless and shaking. Mrs. Sullivan was a steady presence, encouraging her, guiding her, telling her when to push and when to breathe. Kyle paced in the main room, his boots wearing a path in the floor. Grace could hear him through the door, could hear the worry in his voice when he asked Miguel and William for updates. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him she was all right, but she could not spare the breath. Finally, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Grace felt a tremendous pressure, and then sudden, overwhelming relief. A baby's cry filled the room, thin and indignant, and Mrs. Sullivan laughed. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A big, healthy boy with a fine set of lungs." Grace sobbed with relief and exhaustion as Mrs. Sullivan cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets. Then the midwife placed the infant in Grace's arms, and she looked down at her son for the first time. He was beautiful, with a cap of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that somehow managed to be perfect. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his eyes, when they opened briefly, were dark and unfocused. Grace felt a rush of love so powerful it nearly stopped her heart. This was her child, her son, the result of her mistakes and her choices, and she would protect him with every breath in her body. "Does he have a name?" Mrs. Sullivan asked gently. Grace had thought about names for months but had never been able to settle on one. Now, holding her son, she knew exactly what she wanted to call him. "James," she said softly. "His name is James." "A good, strong name," Mrs. Sullivan approved. She looked toward the door. "Should I let Mr. Yancy in? He has been wearing a hole in the floor with his pacing." Grace nodded, suddenly overwhelmed with the need to see Kyle, to share this moment with him. Mrs. Sullivan opened the door and said something, and then Kyle was there, standing in the doorway with an expression of such tender concern that it made Grace's eyes fill with tears. "Come meet James," she said quietly. Kyle approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby in Grace's arms. His face transformed, wonder replacing worry, and he reached out one calloused finger to gently touch the infant's tiny hand. James immediately grasped the finger, holding on with surprising strength, and Kyle's breath caught. "He is perfect," Kyle whispered. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Grace asked. Kyle looked terrified at the prospect. "I do not know how. What if I drop him?" "You will not drop him," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "Just support his head." Carefully, she transferred the baby into Kyle's arms. Kyle held James awkwardly at first, but then the baby settled against his chest, and Kyle's expression softened into something Grace had never seen before, a combination of protectiveness and awe and something that looked remarkably like love. "Hello, James," Kyle said softly. "Welcome to the world, little man." Grace watched them together, this man who had saved her and the child she had carried through so much hardship, and felt something click into place in her heart. She had come to Texas running from her past, desperate and alone. But somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, she had found a home. Not just a place to live, but a true home, with people who cared about her, and a man who looked at her child as though he was precious beyond measure. Over the following weeks, as Grace recovered from the birth and James grew stronger, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Kyle was surprisingly adept with the baby, often taking James from Grace in the evening so she could rest, walking the floor with the infant when he fussed and singing old songs in his rough voice. Grace would watch them together and feel her heart swell with emotions she was still afraid to name. William Carter left after 2 more weeks, fully recovered and grateful for everything Kyle and Grace had done for him. Before he left, he pressed a few dollars into Grace's hand, insisting it was repayment for her care, though Grace protested it was not necessary. "You gave me my life back," William said simply. "That is worth more than I could ever repay." November turned to December, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of winter. Grace had largely recovered her strength, though she was careful not to overdo things. James was thriving, a happy baby who rarely fussed and was already starting to smile at familiar faces. One evening in mid-December, after Grace had put James down for the night and was sitting by the fire with her mending, Kyle came and sat beside her. He had been quieter than usual over the past few days, and Grace had sensed he was working through something in his mind. "Grace, I need to talk to you about something," Kyle said finally, his voice serious. Grace set down her mending, her heart suddenly racing. "All right." Kyle turned to face her fully, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, familiar now after months of casual touches and accidental brushes. "I have been thinking about your situation, about James and what his future will be like." Grace felt her stomach drop. Was Kyle going to ask her to leave? Had she somehow overstepped, presumed too much? "I understand if our presence here has become burdensome," she said quickly. "I have some money saved and I could find other work." "That is not what I mean," Kyle interrupted. He took a deep breath, and Grace saw something like nervousness in his gray eyes, an emotion she had never seen him display before. "Grace, that child deserves a name, a real name, one that will give him standing in this community and protect him from the prejudices of small-minded people. And you deserve a partner, someone who will stand beside you and help you raise him." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "What are you saying?" Kyle squeezed her hand. "I am saying that I want to marry you, Grace. I want to give James my name to raise him as my own son. I want you to be my wife if you will have me." Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "But why? You do not have to do this out of pity or obligation. It is not pity," Kyle said firmly. "Grace, I have been trying to figure out when exactly I fell in love with you, and I honestly cannot pinpoint the moment. Maybe it was that first day in town when I saw you sitting on that bench looking so lost and determined all at once. Maybe it was watching you work yourself to exhaustion to make this house a home. Maybe it was seeing you with James, the fierce love in your eyes when you held him for the first time. But somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my life. I love you, Grace. I love you, and I love that little boy in there, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you both know it." Tears were streaming down Grace's face, but for once, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have loved you for months, but I was afraid to hope that you might feel the same way. I thought you were just being kind, that you could never truly want a woman like me. With my past and my mistakes." Kyle pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Your past does not matter to me," he said fiercely. "What matters is who you are now, the strong, brave, beautiful woman I see every day. You are not your mistakes, Grace. You are so much more than that." Grace buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and something indefinably Kyle. "Yes," she said against his chest. "Yes, I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier." Kyle pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I promise I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy, trying to be the man you and James deserve." Then he kissed her, soft and gentle and full of promise. Grace melted into the kiss, feeling years of loneliness and fear finally falling away. When they broke apart, both breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "When should we do this?" he asked. "When do you want to get married?" Grace laughed, giddy with happiness. "As soon as possible. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary." "Tomorrow, then," Kyle said decisively. "We will ride into town tomorrow and find the preacher. I do not care if it is a simple ceremony. I just want you to be my wife." They were married the next afternoon in the small church in Johnson City, with Miguel and Mrs. Henderson as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress, and Kyle had borrowed a proper suit jacket from the general store owner. James, wrapped in a soft blanket, slept peacefully through the entire ceremony. When the preacher asked if Kyle would take Grace as his lawfully wedded wife, Kyle's voice was strong and sure. "I will." And when it was Grace's turn, she looked into Kyle's gray eyes and felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. "I will." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Kyle kissed her in front of God and the few witnesses with such tenderness that Grace felt her knees go weak. Then they signed the marriage certificate, and Kyle signed the papers to legally adopt James, giving the baby his surname. "James Yancy," Grace whispered, testing out the name. "It sounds perfect." "It is perfect," Kyle agreed, his arm around her waist, just like his mother. They celebrated with a simple dinner at the cafe where Kyle had first bought Grace a meal, and then they returned to the ranch as the sun was setting. As they pulled up in front of the house, Grace felt as though she was seeing it for the first time. This was her home now, truly and completely. Not just a place where she was staying temporarily, but her home, shared with the man she loved and the son who bore his name. That night, after they had put James to bed in the small cradle Kyle had built, Kyle and Grace stood together on the porch, looking out at the star-filled Texas sky. Kyle's arm was around her shoulders, and Grace leaned into his warmth, feeling content in a way she had never experienced before. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she said softly. "After everything that happened, I thought I had ruined my chance at a good life." Kyle turned her to face him, his expression serious. "You did not ruin anything, Grace. You made choices that led you here to me, to this life, and I will be grateful for that every day." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace felt heat flood through her. They were married now, truly husband and wife, and the realization sent a thrill through her. Kyle picked her up in his strong arms and carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind them. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Grace settled fully into her role as Kyle's wife, and he proved to be everything she could have hoped for in a husband. He was patient and kind, passionate and protective. He worked hard to provide for his family, but he always made time for Grace and James, never letting his responsibilities as a rancher overshadow his responsibilities as a husband and father. James thrived, growing rapidly and becoming more alert each day. He adored Kyle, his face lighting up whenever Kyle came into the room, reaching his chubby arms out to be held. Kyle loved the boy fiercely, and Grace often caught him talking to James as though the infant could understand every word, telling him about the ranch and the cattle, and all the things they would do together when James was older. In February, Kyle surprised Grace by hiring a carpenter to build an addition onto the house, adding a proper nursery for James and another bedroom for future children. Grace blushed when he mentioned future children, but the idea filled her with warm anticipation. She wanted more children, wanted to give James siblings and fill their home with laughter and love. Spring came early that year, bringing warm winds and new grass. The cattle were fat and healthy, and Kyle's careful breeding program was starting to show results. He sold a large herd in April for an excellent price and used some of the proceeds to buy Grace a beautiful bay mare. "Every rancher's wife needs her own horse," he said as he led the mare into the yard. "I thought you might like to learn to ride properly so we can go out together sometimes." Grace was delighted. She had ridden a few times as a child, but never well. Kyle spent patient hours teaching her, laughing when she nearly fell off and praising her when she managed to stay on. They began taking rides together in the evenings, with James secured in a sling against Kyle's chest, exploring the ranch land and the wild country beyond. One evening in late May, as they were riding back toward the house with the sunset painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange, Grace pulled her mare to a stop on a small rise overlooking the valley. Kyle stopped beside her, adjusting James, who was dozing contentedly against his father's chest. "What are you thinking about?" Kyle asked, noting her contemplative expression. Grace looked out over the land, at the ranch house nestled in the valley, smoke rising from the chimney, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the endless Texas sky stretching overhead. "I am thinking about how different my life is now from what I imagined it would be. A year ago, I was terrified and alone, carrying a child I did not know how I would raise. I thought my life was over." Kyle reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "And now I have everything I never dared to dream of," Grace said, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "A husband I love more than I thought possible, a son who brings me joy every single day, and a home where I belong. You gave me all of that, Kyle. You saved me." Kyle shook his head gently. "We saved each other, Grace. I was just going through the motions before you came into my life. You gave me purpose, a reason to build something more than just a successful ranch. You gave me a family." They rode back to the house hand in hand, and that night, after they had put James to bed, Kyle made love to Grace with such tenderness and passion that she wept afterward, overwhelmed by the depth of her feelings for this man who had given her everything. Summer arrived with its familiar heat, but Grace found she did not mind it as much as she had the previous year. She was stronger now, more accustomed to the demands of ranch life. She tended her garden, which flourished under her care, and learned to can vegetables and make preserves. She sewed new clothes for James, who was growing at an astonishing rate, and helped Kyle with some of the ranch accounts, discovering she had a head for numbers. In August, on the first anniversary of Grace's arrival in Johnson City, Kyle surprised her with a trip into town. They left James with Mrs. Sullivan for the day, the first time Grace had been separated from her son for more than a few hours, and Kyle took her to the general store. "Pick out whatever you want," he said, gesturing at the bolts of fabric and the ready-made dresses. "I want to buy you something nice, something that makes you feel as beautiful as you look to me." Grace protested that she did not need anything, but Kyle insisted, and eventually she selected a bolt of deep blue fabric that would make a lovely dress for special occasions. Kyle also bought her a silver locket, which he fastened around her neck himself. "For keeping James close to your heart, even when he is not in your arms," Kyle said, and Grace loved him so much in that moment that she could barely breathe. They had dinner at the cafe, and then Kyle took her to the small hotel above the saloon, where he had rented a room for the night. Grace's eyes widened when she realized what he had planned. "Kyle Yancy, did you rent a hotel room so you could have your way with me?" she asked, trying to sound scandalized but unable to keep the laughter from her voice. "I rented a hotel room so we could have a night alone together, like a proper married couple," Kyle corrected, pulling her into his arms. "Is that so wrong?" "It is absolutely scandalous," Grace said, but she was already unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling with anticipation. They made love slowly and thoroughly, taking their time in a way that was rare with a baby in the house. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow hotel bed, talking and laughing and planning their future. Kyle told her he wanted to expand the ranch, to buy the adjacent property that was coming up for sale. Grace told him she wanted to start a small sewing business, taking in mending and making clothes for the other ranch families in the area. "You can do whatever makes you happy," Kyle said, kissing her temple. "As long as you are happy, I am happy." As autumn approached once again, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The realization came one morning when she woke feeling queasy, a familiar sensation that she remembered all too well from carrying James. She waited a few days to be certain, and then she told Kyle one evening after dinner. Kyle's face transformed with joy. He picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh and protest that he was making her dizziness worse. Then he set her down carefully and dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her still flat belly. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Grace ran her fingers through his dark hair, overwhelmed with love for this man who had given her so much. "Are you happy?" she asked. Kyle looked up at her, his gray eyes shining. "Happy does not even begin to cover it, Grace. You have made me the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in May of 1881, Grace gave birth to a daughter. The delivery was easier than James's had been, and within hours, Grace was sitting up in bed, holding her newborn daughter and marveling at her tiny, perfect features. "She looks like you," Kyle said, gazing down at his daughter with absolute adoration. "She has your eyes." "We should name her Catherine," Grace said. "After your mother." Kyle's eyes grew suspiciously bright. He had told Grace stories about his mother, about how she had been the heart of their family before typhoid took her. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Grace said firmly. "Catherine Yancy, it is a strong name for a strong girl." James, now 18 months old and full of energy, was fascinated by his new sister. He would stand by her cradle for long periods, watching her sleep and occasionally reaching out to gently touch her tiny hand. Kyle and Grace watched their children together and marveled at how much their lives had changed. The years that followed were full of joy and hard work. The ranch prospered under Kyle's careful management, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Grace's sewing business grew as well, and she became known for her skill with a needle, taking on increasingly complex projects. They added another addition to the house, creating more space for their growing family. In the spring of 1883, Grace gave birth to their third child, a boy they named Matthew. Kyle joked that they were building their own ranch crew, and Grace laughed and told him that 3 children were quite enough for now. Thank you very much. But despite the exhaustion that came with 3 young children, Grace had never been happier. She loved her life, loved waking up each morning to the sounds of her children laughing and Kyle singing off-key while he shaved. She loved the rhythm of their days, the way they worked together to manage the ranch and raise their family. She loved sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape while Kyle sat beside her and the children played in the yard. One evening in the summer of 1885, Grace was sitting on that porch, rocking baby Matthew while James and Catherine chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Kyle came and sat beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders in the familiar, comfortable way of long married couples. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming to Texas, marrying me, staying here instead of going back east?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "Regret it? Kyle, these have been the happiest years of my life. Why would you even ask that?" Kyle shrugged, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I know this life is not easy. The work is hard, the weather can be brutal, and we are so far from the civilized world you knew before. I just want to make sure you are truly happy, that you do not feel trapped here." Grace set the sleeping Matthew in his cradle and turned to face Kyle fully. She took his face in her hands, looking into those gray eyes that had captured her heart so long ago. "Kyle Yancy, you listen to me. I have never felt trapped here. This ranch, this life, you and our children, this is everything I ever wanted but never knew how to ask for. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave James your name when he had nothing. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. How could I ever regret any of that?" Kyle's arms came around her, pulling her close. "I love you, Grace. More than I did the day we married, which I would not have thought possible." "I love you too," Grace whispered against his chest. "Forever." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, watching their children play and feeling the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. The years would bring more challenges and more joys, more children and more adventures. The ranch would continue to grow, and their family would expand to include grandchildren who would run through these same fields and play in this same yard. But in that moment, with Kyle's arms around her and her children's laughter ringing in the warm evening air, Grace felt complete. She had come to Texas broken and afraid, carrying another man's child and expecting nothing but hardship. Instead, she had found love, acceptance, and a family that was more than she had ever dared to dream of. The mail-order bride had arrived pregnant and alone, and the cowboy had said that child would have his name. But Kyle had given them so much more than just a name. He had given them a home, a future, and a love that would last for all their days. And as Grace looked at her husband's face in the fading light, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice that day. She stepped off the stagecoach in Johnson City. She had come to Texas looking for safety, but she had found something far more precious. She had found love, true and lasting and deeper than the Texas sky. She had found a partner who saw her not for her mistakes but for her strength. She had found a father for her children who loved them as fiercely as if they had all been born of his blood. And she had found herself, the woman she was always meant to be, strong and capable and worthy of love. The journey had been hard, filled with fear and uncertainty and moments when Grace had doubted she would survive. But every hardship had led her here, to this porch, to this man, to this life. And she would not change a single moment of it, because every step had been necessary to bring her home. As the last light faded from the sky and Kyle rose to call the children inside for bed, Grace looked out over the ranch one more time. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. The creek bubbled over its stones, singing its endless song. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. And Grace smiled because this was her home, her world, her heart made manifest in wood and stone and the people she loved. The mail-order bride had arrived pregnant and alone, but she had not stayed alone. The cowboy had said that child would have his name, and in doing so, had given them all so much more. He had given them love, and that was the greatest gift of all.